The Gulag system, a historical narrative. In the winter of 1918, as the Russian Civil War tore through the remnants of the empire, a new kind of archipelago began to form across the vastness of the Soviet lands. It was not made of islands surrounded by water, but of camps surrounded by wire and watchtowers, scattered like dark constellations from the frozen ports of the White Sea to the volcanic peninsulas of the Far East. The Bolsheviks, having seized power just months before, found themselves besieged by enemies on all sides, and in their minds, enemies within. The solution they conceived would become one of the most extensive systems of forced labor and political imprisonment the world had ever known. The first camps emerged almost casually, born from the chaos of revolution and civil war. Lenin himself signed the decree in September 1918, authorizing the creation of concentration camps for class enemies, a term so elastic it could stretch to encompass almost anyone. Former Tsarist officers, priests, merchants, intellectuals who questioned Bolshevik methods, peasants who resisted grain requisitions, all found themselves swept into a growing network of detention. These early camps were improvised affairs, housed in abandoned monasteries, old fortresses, and requisitioned estates. The guards were often as confused as the prisoners about what, exactly, was supposed to happen within those walls. But the principle was established. The new Soviet state would isolate, contain, and extract labor from those it deemed dangerous or expendable. The true architect of the system that would come to define Soviet repression was not Lenin, but the apparatus that survived and grew after him. By the time Stalin consolidated power in the late 1920s, the camps had evolved from temporary holding centers into permanent fixtures of the Soviet economy. The transition was both ideological and practical. The first five-year plan, launched in 1928, demanded impossible quotas of industrial output and infrastructure development. The Soviet Union needed railroads through Siberia, canals connecting distant waterways, mines extracting gold and coal and timber from regions so remote and hostile that free laborists would never go there willingly. The camps provided the solution, an inexhaustible supply of workers who cost almost nothing to maintain and whose lives could be spent like currency in the pursuit of socialist construction. The White Sea Canal project, begun in 1931, became the prototype for what the Gulag would become. Over 100,000 prisoners were sent to dig a channel connecting the White Sea to the Baltic, using little more than hand tools, wheelbarrows, and wooden scaffolding. They worked through the brutal northern winters, where temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, where the ground froze so hard that pickaxes bounced off the earth like striking iron. The prisoners slept in unheated barracks, wore clothing that turned stiff with ice, ate thin soup and black bread that barely sustained life. Thousands died, their bodies buried in unmarked graves along the canal route or simply left where they fell. When the canal was completed in 1933, Stalin celebrated it as a triumph of Soviet will and engineering. The fact that it was too shallow for most vessels was not mentioned. The fact that it had been built with the lives of men and women worked to death was transformed into propaganda, a story of redemption through labor. Who were these prisoners, these enemies of the people who found themselves in the camps? In the beginning, they were the obvious targets: former nobility, white army officers, Orthodox clergy, anyone associated with the old regime. But as the years progressed, the categories expanded with terrifying logic. The collectivization of agriculture in the early 1930s created millions of new enemies overnight. Kulaks, the term used for supposedly wealthy peasants, were deported en masse to remote settlements and labor camps. The definition of kulak was fluid, sometimes meaning a farmer who owned a few extra animals, sometimes meaning anyone who resisted giving up their land to the collective farm. Entire villages were emptied, their populations loaded onto freight trains and sent east into exile. Many died during the journey itself, packed into unheated cars during the winter, given no food or water for days. Those who survived found themselves in special settlements, forbidden zones where they were expected to build their own barracks, clear forests, and establish farms in soil that had never been cultivated, all while under guard and unable to leave. The Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 brought a new wave of prisoners, this time targeting the party itself, the military, the intelligentsia, anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to Stalin's absolute control. The arrests followed a pattern that became grimly familiar. A knock on the door at night. The NKVD officers entering the apartment, searching through papers and books. The accused taken away, often still in nightclothes, leaving behind family members who would wake to find an empty bed and no explanation. In the interrogation rooms of the Lubyanka and countless other security facilities, confessions were extracted through sleeplessness, beatings, threats against loved ones. The accused were made to sign statements admitting to crimes they had not committed, to espionage for countries they had never visited, to conspiracies that existed only in the paranoid imagination of the security apparatus. Once the confession was signed, the sentence was predetermined. 10 years in the camps, the standard term, though few expected to survive that long. The trains that carried prisoners to the camps were journeys into darkness. The Stolopin cars, named ironically after Tsarist minister, were converted freight wagons with tiny barred windows and shelves for sleeping that allowed no room to sit upright. The journeys could last weeks, crossing the endless expanses of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Prisoners received almost no food, a piece of bread every few days, a herring that had to be shared among dozens. The thirst was worse than the hunger. In summer, the cars became ovens, the air inside thick and suffocating. In winter, they became freezers, the walls coated with frost, the prisoners huddling together for warmth that never came. At each stop, the guards would slide open the doors and remove the bodies of those who had died during the night, tossing them onto the platform like discarded cargo. Arrival at the camp brought no relief, only a new phase of the ordeal. The largest camp complexes were cities unto themselves, sprawling zones that could hold tens of thousands of prisoners. Kolyma, in the far northeast, became synonymous with death. The region was rich in gold, and the camps there existed solely to extract it from the frozen ground. Prisoners worked in the mines, descending into shafts where the temperature remained below freezing year-round, or in open pit operations where they broke apart permafrost with explosives and primitive tools. The workday was measured not by hours but by quotas. Each prisoner was expected to produce a certain amount of or excavated earth. Those who failed to meet their quota had their food rations reduced, creating a death spiral. Weakened by hunger, they could do less work. Doing less work meant less food. Less food meant greater weakness. The end was inevitable. The logic of the camps was deliberate. The system was designed to extract maximum labor while expending minimum resources on the prisoner's survival. Food was calculated to keep a worker alive just long enough to be useful, but not a day longer. The daily ration varied by camp and by period, but typically consisted of bread, often mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies, a watery soup made from whatever scraps were available, perhaps some salted fish. A working prisoner might receive 800 grams of bread per day if they met their quota, 500 grams if they did not. It was never enough. Prisoners learned to become scavengers, eating grass, bark, anything that might fill the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. Some camps were located near villages, and prisoners would risk punishment to slip through the wire at night and beg food from local residents who were themselves struggling to survive. The cold was an enemy as constant as hunger. In the northern camps, winter lasted 8 months of the year. Prisoners worked outdoors regardless of temperature, felling trees in the taiga, laying railroad tracks across the tundra, mining coal in open pits. The clothing provided was inadequate by design: a quilted jacket that offered little insulation, thin trousers, boots that often fell apart within weeks. Prisoners learned to stuff their clothing with straw or paper for extra warmth, to wrap their feet in rags when their boots disintegrated. Frostbite was universal. Men and women lost fingers and toes to the cold, sometimes entire hands or feet. The camp medical facilities, such as they were, offered little help. Doctors were themselves often prisoners, working without proper equipment or supplies. Gangrene was treated with amputation, performed without anesthetic. Those too sick or injured to work were sometimes simply left to die in the barracks, their bodies removed when convenient. Yet within this system designed to break the human spirit, something unexpected persisted. Prisoners formed communities, networks of mutual support that provided the margin between death and survival. They shared food when they could, protected the weak when possible, maintained their humanity through acts of kindness that the system tried to eliminate. In some camps, intellectuals organized clandestine universities, teaching history, literature, mathematics to fellow prisoners during the brief hours between work and sleep. Musicians fashioned instruments from scraps and performed concerts in the barracks. Poets composed verses and committed them to memory, knowing that written words could be confiscated. These acts of cultural resistance were small rebellions against the machinery of dehumanization, assertions that the prisoners remained human even when the system treated them as expendable tools. The Gulag was not merely a system of punishment. It was integral to the Soviet economy in ways that the leadership freely acknowledged, at least internally. The NKVD, which administered the camps, operated as a vast economic enterprise. It controlled timber production, mining operations, construction projects, even agricultural estates. The labor of prisoners built entire cities, laid thousands of kilometers of railroad track, dug canals, and excavated mines. The city of Magadan, the administrative center of Kolyma, was built entirely by prisoner labor. The Baikal-Amur Railway, one of the great infrastructure projects of the Stalin era, was constructed largely by camp inmates working in conditions that guaranteed massive casualties. The economic report sent to Moscow calculated the value of prisoner labor in tons of coal produced, cubic meters of timber harvested, kilometers of track laid. The human cost was recorded separately, if at all. The war that began in June 1941 changed the camps in complex ways. When Nazi Germany invaded, the Soviet Union suddenly needed soldiers more than it needed slave laborers. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were released from the camps and sent directly to the front, often without weapons or proper training, used as cannon fodder in the desperate defense of Moscow and Leningrad. Others remained in the camps, their labor now devoted to producing war material, mining the metals needed for tanks and aircraft, logging the timber for military construction. The conditions, already brutal, became catastrophic. Food that had been inadequate became nearly non-existent as resources flowed to the front. Mortality rates in the camps soared. In some complexes, half the prison population died during the war years. Victory in 1945 brought no liberation for those in the camps. Instead, new waves of prisoners arrived. Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans and survived, returning home expecting gratitude, found themselves accused of treason for having surrendered. Civilians from the newly occupied territories of Eastern Europe, deemed politically unreliable, were deported to the camps. Entire ethnic groups were punished for alleged collaboration with the Nazis. The Chechens, the Ingush, the Crimean Tatars, the Volga Germans, all were loaded onto trains and sent into exile, their villages destroyed, their names erased from maps. The camps absorbed these new populations, adding to the millions already imprisoned. Stalin's death in March 1953 created a moment of uncertainty in the camps. The guards seemed less certain of their authority. The prisoners, sensing a shift, became bolder. In the summer of 1953, a major uprising occurred at the Kengir camp in Kazakhstan. Thousands of prisoners, men and women both, rose up and seized control of the camp, declaring they would not return to work until their grievances were addressed. They held out for 40 days, organizing their own government within the camp, maintaining discipline, negotiating with the authorities. The Soviet response was unambiguous. Tanks entered the camp, crushing prisoners beneath their treads, firing into the crowds. The rebellion was suppressed with hundreds dead, and those who survived faced new sentences for participation in an anti-Soviet uprising. Yet the death of Stalin had indeed broken something in the system. His successors, particularly Khrushchev, understood that the Gulag as it existed was unsustainable, economically inefficient, and a liability to the regime's international image. Beginning in 1954, mass releases began. Millions of prisoners were freed, given documents certifying their rehabilitation, and sent back into Soviet society. They returned to find that the world had moved on without them. Families had dissolved. Children did not recognize parents who had been absent for 10 or 15 years, Apartments had been occupied by others. Many former prisoners were forbidden from returning to Moscow or Leningrad or other major cities, forced to settle in provincial towns where they remained under suspicion. The state that had stolen years of their lives offered no apology, no compensation, only a stamped paper saying they were no longer enemies. The camps did not disappear entirely. They were scaled back, reorganized, given new names and new purposes, but they continued. Political prisoners in smaller numbers were still sent to labor colonies. Dissidents in the 1960s and 70s found themselves in the same camps that had held earlier generations, working in the same mines, the same forests. The system had become too embedded in the Soviet state to simply dismantle. It had shaped how the regime understood power, how it dealt with opposition, how it organized labor. The camps had become, in a real sense, central to what the Soviet Union was, not an aberration but a fundamental feature. The full truth of the Gulag only began to emerge when the Soviet Union itself was collapsing. Archives were opened, survivors published their testimonies, mass graves were discovered and excavated. The numbers remain disputed, but conservative estimates suggest that between 18 million and 20 million people passed through the Gulag between 1930 and 1953. Of these, perhaps 1.5 to 2 million died in the camps themselves, from exhaustion, starvation, cold, disease, or simple violence. Millions more died in transit or shortly after release, their bodies too damaged to recover. These numbers do not include those who died in the special settlements, the internal exile zones, or those executed outright without ever reaching a camp. The physical traces of the Gulag are fading now. The camps themselves, once such prominent features of the Soviet landscape, are rusting away in remote forests and tundra. The barracks have collapsed, the watchtowers lean at dangerous angles, the barbed wire is buried under decades of moss and vegetation. In some locations, local residents have erected small monuments, listing the names of the dead when names are known, simply acknowledging the suffering when they are not. But in the vastness of Russia, most of the camps are unmarked and forgotten, visited only by the wind and the snow, the earth holding its secrets as it has held the bodies of those who died there. The question that haunts any reckoning with the Gulag is how it was possible. How did millions of Soviet citizens participate in or tolerate a system that imprisoned and killed their neighbors, their colleagues, sometimes their own family members? The answer is complex, rooted in ideology, fear, propaganda, and the human capacity for moral compartmentalization. Many genuinely believed they were defending the revolution against real enemies, that the arrests and imprisonments were necessary, that the party knew things ordinary citizens could not know. Others were afraid that asking questions or expressing sympathy for the repressed would mark them as enemies too. The system created an atmosphere in which everyone was potentially guilty, everyone could be accused, and therefore everyone had an interest in not looking too closely at what was being done in the name of building socialism. And yet, the prisoners themselves, those millions who survived and those millions who did not, remain the enduring testimony against the ideology that created the camps. In their memoirs and testimonies, in the poems they composed and remembered, in the songs they sang in the barracks, they recorded not just suffering but the persistence of human dignity in conditions designed to destroy it. They proved that even in the coldest camps of Kolyma, even in the deepest mines, even facing death by starvation and exhaustion, people could choose to remain human, to help one another, to preserve hope when hope seemed absurd. This was their victory over the system, small and personal and uncounted in any economic report, but real nonetheless. The Gulag was many things: a system of political repression, an economic enterprise, a tool of social engineering, a manifestation of totalitarian power. But above all, it was a place where millions of individual human beings faced the cruelest test imaginable and, in their varied ways, endured. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as statistics or abstractions, but as the lived experiences of people who loved and hoped and suffered, who fought to survive another day, who died in the snow far from home. They are gone now, almost all of them, the survivors and the dead alike. But the camps they inhabited, the system that consumed them, remains a warning across time about what becomes possible when ideology is valued above human life, when the state claims the right to define who belongs and who does not, when the end is held to justify any means. The frozen earth of Siberia still holds their remains, and their memory asks something of those who come after, that we remember what was done, that we speak their names when we can, and that we remain vigilant against the darkness that created the camps, should it ever rise again.